and as a result of that, I've handled a whole bunch of retail issues over the years. But for the past 5 or 10 years, I guess, maybe, we've spent a lot of time with our clients working on privacy and data security issues. And as you've probably all noticed, 2014 has become known as the year of the hack. So data security has become a much more common topic. And one of the things we wanted to talk to you about today was the importance of being prepared, and particularly having a data breach response plan. So that's what I hope to cover with you all today. I will disclose early on that I am not an IT person. I don't have a technical background, so hopefully you won't pepper me with specific technical questions. Most of what I want to talk about really is on more the practical side. So we'll kind of get into things that we should be doing to prepare and what our plan should look like, and we'll have some specific recommendations for you towards the end of the presentation. At any time, if you do have questions, please feel free to raise your hand. I'm glad to take those with us. I did not know, by the way, how much time I was going to have until I got here, so I don't know exactly how this presentation will fit the 45 minutes that we have. I'll do my best. Again, if there are questions, let's go ahead and raise your hand during the presentation. Before I begin, I would like to ask a little bit about you all, so I'm going to ask you a couple questions if you don't mind. Maybe you can respond by raising your hand. Do any of you in this room have a legal background? Are any of you lawyers or paralegals or have had any legal training? Okay. Have any of you recently been involved with a data breach or had a data breach at your company? I'm a little surprised. I thought I'd see more hands on that one. So a couple. For those of you that have, did your company or organization have a data breach response plan in place at the time of the breach? That one I'm not so surprised at, because frankly, while we are becoming more and more aware that this is a real threat, preparing for it is not necessarily something we want to do, right? While cyber insurance is becoming more common, again, preparing for a breach of sensitive, secured information is not something that a lot of companies are doing. And what I hope to convey to you today, that it is an important and essential concept that you all should be bringing back to your organizations. So with that, let me go ahead and begin. Let's talk a little bit about data security. What is data security? And again, as I mentioned, I'm not an IT person, so you guys probably have a much better understanding of what data security is than I do. But for my purposes, data security or information security is the protection of information from a wide range of threats in order to ensure business continuity, to minimize business risk, and maximize return on investments and business opportunities. And you'll see that each of these three elements will become very important as I go through my presentation today, and particularly the one that I think people sometimes forget a lot about. Right? If you have a data breach, if you have a threat of some kind, you're almost immediately your focus goes to minimizing the risk and containing and remediating, right? But what about the business continuity and ongoing business nature of your organization? So something that I think we'll spend a little bit more time talking about. In my view, there are 3 types of security measures that you should all be thinking about when you're talking about a data breach response plan. Number 1, physical security measures. And you all know what those are, right? Locks on the doors, fire extinguishers in the secure rooms, things of that nature, the physical security measures. We also need to think a little bit about technical security measures. Access controls. Who has rights to certain types of information? What type of encryption are we using? Again, some of the highly technical stuff that you all are probably more accustomed to than I am, but that's a second element of security that we need to think about when we're drafting our data breach response plan. And then lastly, administrative security measures. Security management processes and things of that nature. Training and awareness. Those are all things that should go into our data security. There are also, I would suggest, 3 phases of security measures that you need to think about, right? Number 1, preventative. At the front end, what are the things that we're doing to make sure that we don't have a data breach or that we can prevent threats of security intrusion? Number 2, detective measures. Where are the fire alarms? What alarm goes off when we do have a threat of some sort or a breach of some sort? And then finally, reactive. And I would again suggest to you that our data breach response plan will take into account all three phases, maybe focusing mostly on the last phase, reactive, but those are all three things that we should be thinking about as we begin our data breach response plan preparation. If there's nothing that you walk out of here with today, the one thing I hope you will remember is that data security has to become a mission critical priority, and it has to be at every level of the organization. Data breach prevention and mitigation is a C-suite issue. It's not just an IT issue. So many of the clients that I work with sort of delegate this responsibility to their IT department, including, by the way, for a while, my law firm. And until we created our own information governance committee, the IT department was responsible for all this. But again, I would suggest to you, it's a much larger task than just IT. Just ask Target. I mean, in 2014, Target spent $145 million in relation to its data breach. And I'm sure you're all aware of the Target data breach. It's the one that kind of set the things in motion. So again, just to show you, $145 million related to that data breach. And by the way, the costs haven't stopped. They're going to continue to rise. As I mentioned, 2014 was the year of the hack. Over 1 billion records were compromised in 2014 alone, through only 1,500 incidents. That's a 78% increase over the number of records compromised in 2013. I would suggest to you that 2015 might not be any better. The bad guys are also very smart. I mean, all of you are very smart in what you do. The bad guys are pretty smart too, and they're always trying to stay ahead of our data security measures. And now they're looking at what I would suggest are long-term identity theft means. They're looking at ways to actually create credit cards and create means by which they can take out loans and take money from unsuspecting customers and retailers. So I think these threats are going to continue to rise, and I think that we need, as representative of our organizations on the IT side and on the legal side, start to put into place means to be responsive to the ongoing threats. Yes, we have a question.
Are those numbers worldwide or just the US?
Those are worldwide. So I think, again, we want to talk a little bit about being prepared, right? Having a data breach response plan. What do we do once an incident occurs? I would suggest to you that you need to be prepared for several reasons. You are going to be immediately peppered with demands from all different areas. First and foremost, you're going to have customers to think about. If there's a data breach at a retailer, for example, that's customer data that's been affected. And we need to think about how we protect them. That's our goodwill. As a retailer, our customers are the lifeblood of our business. We need to be responsive to our customers. Of course, at a maybe a more immediate level, we need to be thinking about containment and remediation, a very immediate and direct requirement. Payment card brands. We're going to spend a lot of time today talking about the payment card brands because, frankly, it's the payment. And by the way, most of what I'll be talking about today is dealing with the threat of sensitive financial information and sensitive healthcare information, because that's where the real threats exist. So the payment card brands are going to be a significant player in what we talk about today. As most of you know, if you're a retailer or if you're accepting credit cards, a hotel, etc., you have a relationship with the credit card company. And in most instances, you have a contract with them. And in almost all instances, those contracts have certain requirements of you based on if in fact there's a threat to that sensitive credit card information. So the payment card brands are going to have immediate demands of you if there is an incident. Of course, public relations is an issue. That's something that you'll have to deal with very immediately as well. You will want to think about having outside forensic investigators. Not will you only want to think about it, but again, going back to the payment card brands, your contracts with Visa, MasterCard, American Express, etc., have requirements in them that require you to have a PCI-compliant forensic investigator. We'll talk more about that in a minute. So you're going to be, within days, you're going to have to deal with hiring forensic investigators. If you're a publicly held company, there are certain SEC requirements, but even beyond that, I would suggest to you that your major shareholders are going to want to be immediately advised of any threat to the business. So in the very first few days, maybe first few hours, you're going to have to deal with your potential major shareholders. The day that Target sent out public notice that they had a significant data breach, 7 class action lawsuits were filed. Now think about what I just said. The day they gave notice, and I'm a lawyer, so I can make fun of lawyers, right? 7 very entrepreneurial, actually it was a lot more than 7, but 7 groups of very entrepreneurial plaintiffs' lawyers filed lawsuits against Target. And by the way, there are lots and lots more filed after that, but that very day, 7 lawsuits were filed. You're going to have to deal with the threat of litigation immediately upon learning of a data breach. And then finally, risk management, insurance, cybersecurity. Those are things that you're going to want to very immediately start dealing with and addressing upon learning of a data breach. So why do I put these up there? Again, these are all of these things are all the things that are going to draw your attention immediately upon learning of a data breach. So the point being, you're going to be in the best position to deal with these if you have a plan in place prior to a data breach occurring. Again, that's what I want to talk about today, being prepared. Why should we have a data breach response plan? Why should we be prepared? Well, I would suggest to you there are 3 very good reasons. Number 1, as I mentioned, there are going to be lots of demands on your interest and time, as I just pointed out. So strategically, I think it's important that you be prepared, that you know who's going to deal with what. You'll have certain tasks assigned to various people in your organization, and you'll know who's going to know what the best way to communicate about it is. Strategically, that's a good reason to have data breach plan. Secondly, as I mentioned, you may have contractual obligations to have a data breach response plan. If you have a contract with the various credit card brands, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, again, etc., your contract may very well require that to be PCI compliant, payment card industry compliant, you may very well be required to have a data breach response plan. And then finally, just good prudence. Complying with industry best practices mitigates the risk of a later regulatory investigation and a consent decree. If the Federal Trade Commission, for example, comes to you and says, we understand you had a data breach, were you prepared for it, and you hold up your data breach response plan, you're probably going to be in a better position to mitigate your risks. Okay? So again, 3 very good reasons, in my view, to have a data breach response plan. By the way, I would also suggest to you that, again, when you leave here today, you go back to your own organizations, you might want to suggest to the sales audit folks or the people who are dealing with the credit card companies that you review your contracts and really have a good understanding of what is required of you in addition to being PCI compliant, but what are your obligations in the event of a data breach. You'd be surprised what's in those contracts. And by the way, they're about that thick. So I would suggest that you do that in advance. Okay, so I just explained to you why we should have a data breach plan. What are our goals? And again, as I mentioned to you, this is all pretty practical stuff, pretty basic stuff. To reduce the risk of an unauthorized data access, right? And again, that's maybe more on the IT side, on the preventative side. We should be thinking about it. It should become a part of the company culture. We should be prepared for it. And then, of course, to mitigate the damage caused not if, but when a breach occurs. I hate to tell you, but we're counseling our clients that a data breach is no longer a question of if. It's a question of when. In a survey of in-house corporate counsel, they were asked, what is the one thing that you lay in bed awake at night about? What's the most significant risk that your company faces? And the answer was overwhelmingly, I think it was in the 75% range, overwhelmingly a data breach. Okay? So again, I would suggest to you, this is a real threat, and it's something that keeps people up at night, so being prepared is a good way to go. So let's talk about our plan. How do we create a plan? What do we do? What are the first things we should do? Well, I would suggest to you that one of the very first things you should do is start to create your core team. And it will require a team, by the way. I think having someone from the in-house legal department is probably the best start. And if you don't have an in-house legal department, maybe contacting an outside lawyer to help you with this. I'm not here to sell my services, guys, but I do think that the legal framework does require some outside consultation on this. So starting with legal is a good place. But again, who are the people that we should have on our core team? I would suggest to you there are a number of areas in your organization that you might want to first look. And of course, it's going to depend on your organization. I mean, if you're a relatively small company, the alternatives may be few to you. But in larger organizations, there are lots of different areas where you may want to look to create and build out your core team. So for example, you may have an anti-fraud group, loss prevention. You may want someone from your loss prevention team on your core team. Breach management. Not many organizations have a breach management team, but some do. If you do, you might want to start there. Obviously, on the IT side, you want to have your IT security folks involved, because that goes more to the prevention that we mentioned earlier. So someone representing the IT team. The CIO may want to be involved in your core team. As I mentioned, legal, HR, particularly if you're dealing with employee information. And then risk management, particularly now that cybersecurity insurance is becoming more and more common theme, you may want to have someone from your risk management team on there. But having a core team in place is important, because what I think you'll find as we progress with our discussion this morning, it's very important that you have what I call, and maybe this isn't the best phrase, but what I call sort of a workflow process. I mean, you're going to almost have to have a decision tree as you build out your data breach response plan. Because as you know better than I, there are all kinds of things that come up during the day. And not every one of them, frankly, most of them do not arise to the level of a real data breach threat. Okay? So you need to have a team in place that knows how to process what we're learning and to put it in the hands of the appropriate people for the appropriate handling. Escalation, in my view, is the key. Okay? Something comes in the door, you learn about it, your team decides it's something we need to respond to, and then depending on what they decide, how do we respond to it? And it gets escalated, so to speak. Containment and preservation of forensic evidence is also very important in this process, because again, as I said, there are going to be possible lawsuits. You're going to be dealing with the payment card brands who want to assess you if you have a violation of that contract that I mentioned. So you're going to want to be able to defend yourself in the event that you do have a data breach. Again, more in your bailiwick than mine, what about the network diagrams? I mean, you want to have those all accessible, because the forensic experts are going to very quickly need to see those. So that will all be part of gathering the information and putting your team in place. Okay, there. Oh, I guess I went a little too far. Okay. So as I said, it's all about escalation, right? One of the key things that your plan should identify or define, in my view, is what is a data breach. And you can define it, and you can call it different things. For purposes of our discussion today, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but I think in your parlance, there's a distinction between an event and an incident, right? So we have events that happen pretty regularly, right? An event, to my understanding, is a localized, contained in time, scope, and effect, and does not require external notice. Now, that last part is really more of a legal requirement, right? There are certain obligations to give notice if certain kinds of information is accessed. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. But again, going back to the contracts that you all have with Visa and MasterCard and American Express, for example, you have to give notice when certain types of information is accessed. So when notice is not required, I would suggest that it does not rise to the level of an incident, but is instead an event and should be handled along that escalation path as appropriate. All right? So your data breach response plan, I would suggest to you, should set out to define those types of things. And again, you don't have to call them event or incident. You can call them whatever is most in line with your business function. I have a client, for example, that actually flipped the two. Why? I have no idea, but they call the lesser of these two things an incident, and they call the event the more significant risk to the business, an event. Some clients have used phrases that are completely different. But the first thing that we need to do is identify which of these two we're dealing with, okay? And that should go into your data breach response plan. You want to have certainty. You want to have consistency. You want your IT security people to know when they need to push a certain button. They need to know when they need to call or escalate the matter to the core team. So that's the goal here. You want to have a fairly discrete, fairly identifiable definition of a series of things so that the core team knows when to take the next step, when to escalate something. That's, in my view, the critical piece of the decision-making tree. What I tried to do here with this slide, and I hope you don't mind, it's a little small, but so I'll kind of walk through it. What I tried to do with this slide was to point out for you sort of the chain of events that's going to occur over the period of some time if, in fact, you identify an incident, okay? So for our purposes now, we've identified that our organization has had an incident, a data breach of some sort, a data breach that does require notice, that's going to pose significant risk to the business. What are the things that we need to deal with? What does the core team need to deal with? Well, I would suggest to you that there are a number of them. As I said earlier, there are going to be immediate demands on your interest and time at the very beginning. So what are they? Well, here they are. I think within the first 24 hours, you're going to need to start your internal investigation. You're going to need to start to identify the issue, figure out what the cause was. You're going to need to engage in containment, and you're probably going to need to, at that point, notify your emergency management response team. Okay? Again, maybe that's your core team, maybe it's a group broader than your core team. But we're probably now going to need to take it to the next level. We also need to start thinking about the notification requirements that we have in our contracts. So, for example, if we have contracts with Visa and MasterCard, we may now need to give notice to the payment card brands that we've had an incident. Yes, we have a question.
Yeah, I guess my question is that within 24 hours of any type of event or incident, you know, from a contractual notification, what are you really going to tell them? Most of the time, you're still trying to get your arms around what actually happened.
Well, candidly, you just made my point of the day. I mean, my point is that this all happens so quickly and so rapidly, and there's so much going on that the only way to handle this is to be prepared. Most contracts with Visa, for example, require that you give them notice within 5 days of an incident. Okay? So within that first 24 hours, you're needing to figure out what the heck happened. And I'm going to get ahead of myself a little bit here, but I would suggest to you that you're walking a very, very fine line between communicating brand protection, as I'll call it, goodwill. We want to be fair, forthright, and honest with our customers, with the consuming public, but we don't want, and so we want to give them some information, but we're not really in a position to give them a lot of information because we may not know it. Okay? I mean, again, I hate to keep picking on them, but if you look at what happened with Target, they didn't give certain information in the first couple days, and they took a lot of heat for that. And then they came out with a press release with information that was a bit premature, and I won't get into all the details, but just one example. They said there were 40 million customers that were affected, and then 2 days later or 3 days later, I can't remember exactly, they had to clarify that it was actually 70 million. And they took a ton of heat for being incorrect with the first one. They lied to us. They don't know what they're doing. So it's a very fine line. I mean, your point is absolutely correct. It's a very fine line to walk between, you know, wanting to be forthright and upfront and tell everybody what's happening, and to appear as if we're you know, good, upstanding citizens, and on the other hand, maybe not really knowing and trying to be somewhat qualified in what we say. So it's a very difficult place to be in, but yes, what you'll find is you have to respond within hours, if not days, in some instances. So being prepared is the key. All right, and as I said, the very day that Target gave public notice, 7 class action lawsuits were filed. So you're going to have the legal team up and ready to go like the day you give notice. Moving on, PR, other external communications, call centers. Literally within the first couple days, if you give notice that your organization has had a breach, do you think customers are going to start calling to ask about their personal information? So before you give notice, you better have your call centers in place. You better have a phone number dedicated so that your customers know where to call. And again, in the Target case, they had a call center in place, but they took heat because there were so many calls that came in that people were having to wait 45 minutes, an hour to speak with a person. So not only do you need to have your call centers in place, you have had to have correctly assessed how many calls you're going to get and make sure you have sufficient call centers in place. We recently worked on a data breach where I had 2 call centers in place. I had a primary call center based out on the West Coast, and I had a backup call center here on the East Coast. So again, a lot of thought goes into this. I would suggest the best way to handle it is before you have an event. Or an incident, I guess I should say. So again, just kind of walking through these, you're going to have calls to the payment card associations and negotiations with the payment card associations literally beginning within days after you learn of this. So you have to have the core team in place and the people from your core team who's going to be dealing with your payment card companies. You're going to have your technical people working with your forensic investigators so that you can now, again, get to the nitty-gritty. What is it that would happen? How do we assess the damage? What is the cause? How do we contain the cause? These are all things that are happening on a very quick time frame. Let me also take this opportunity to suggest to you that in addition to having a core team, hiring a data breach coach is also something that has become very common nowadays. So having someone off staff, and again, not that I'm making a pitch, sometimes it's a lawyer who can come in, help you at the front end with preparing your data breach response plan, training your people on the data breach response plan, and then being available to you if in fact you do have a data breach to walk you through the plan and to help you with the process. Completely separate and apart from the day-to-day operations of the organization, completely tied to the data breach response plan. Because I forgot to mention one other thing a couple slides back. When all these things are going on, right, you got all those assessments that you're making, you're dealing with the card companies and you're dealing with the class action lawyers and all that stuff is going on, guess what else is going on? You're still running a business, right? You still have the day-to-day operations of your business. So you now have 2 jobs essentially. So having someone else to help you with that may not be a bad idea. All right, so let's talk a little more specifically about the things that are going to happen. I hit on some of these, but let me get in a little more detail. This is what I call phase 1, the first 24 hours. Okay, as I mentioned, the core team determines if this is an event or an incident, and depending on which one it is, things kick into gear. If it's an incident, you need to take further action. You activate your workflow processes. And you should work to determine the form and type of data, the source of the data, and the potential size of the data that's involved. Because the type of data involved will determine, to a certain extent, what other additional actions you may have to take. Still within the first 24 hours, you're going to want to start advising internally about the incident, okay? You may now, as I said, you may now need to go to members outside your core team. As I suggested, you may want to advise your board of directors if you're a public company, or even if you're not, if you have a board of directors, you may want to advise them. The general counsel is going to have a significant role in all of this. Because of the threat of litigation, the general counsel and outside counsel, to a certain extent, should absolutely be consulted, if for no other reason but to think about the attorney-client privilege and the attorney work product. That is important because remember, everything that you're doing during this data breach could very likely be discoverable if you have a litigation down the road. And I promise you, if you have a data breach, you will have litigation. Okay? So you want to think about that. And then, you might want to talk to the people who own the information. If, for example, it's employee information, you better go to the HR department. You better tell them what's going on. They need to know about it. Of course, you'll want to start your internal investigation. All this within the first 24 hours. Those are the things that you'll want to do like immediately. Now, phase 2, the first 24 to 72 hours, 3-day period. What are we doing? As I suggested, you're going to want to make your notifications to the payment card brands. The contracts will specify, most say, as I said, 5 days. You want to go back and review your contracts. Make sure that you're doing that. Those very same contracts suggest or require that within 10 business days from notifying the payment card of a possible breach, that you sign a contract with a PFI. So what is a PFI? A PFI is a forensic investigator that's been approved by the payment card industry. It's a PCI, payment card industry, forensic investigator. So the payment card industry, Visa, MasterCard, they have a little association. It's kind of a monopoly, by the way. They have a little association. And they approve certain types of forensic investigators. Your contract with Visa and MasterCard and American Express requires that within 10 business days that you sign a contract with one of those PFIs to come to your facility and to start an independent investigation of what happened, of the breach. Because they're going to use that, and you're paying for it, by the way, but they're going to use that investigation to then evaluate whether or not you breached your contract with Visa or MasterCard or American Express, and they're going to use that to then assess penalties and fines on you for violations of that contract. So you're going to pay for an independent investigator to be used against you, just FYI. You may at the same time want to retain your own, and I would strongly suggest that if you have a breach like Target had, or like Home Depot had, or like Neiman Marcus had, one of these very large-scale breaches, I would strongly encourage you to retain counsel, number one, and then have your lawyers retain an independent forensic investigator. Again, if you have any familiarity at all with the legal world, it's kind of the battle of the experts, right? So you have this PFI who's going to be doing an investigation kind of on behalf of the card companies. You're going to want to have your own expert who can evaluate what the PFI found and maybe give you some ammunition to refute not only what the PFI found, but what the plaintiff's lawyers are going to say in the lawsuits. Okay? Independent forensic investigator. And then, again, per your contract, you have to submit a standardized initial report to the payment card associations within 3 days. So you have a pretty short window here to get a lot done. In order to respond to the payment card companies, you should have a bunch of information available to you, right? You should start with having the contact information available for not only the card companies, but the card processors and your acquiring bank. And I won't get into a lot of detail here because we don't have a lot of time, but in addition to having a relationship with Visa and MasterCard and American Express, most organizations that accept those types of payment have processors that help them, and they go through an acquiring bank. So you need to be in line with all of those folks with communications if something like this were to happen. And as I mentioned, on your core team, you should have identified the individual who's going to be the person responsible for working through those organizations. My last bullet point goes to what I said a minute ago. I strongly suggest that you have your outside lawyer enter into a contract with the independent forensic investigator so that you have an independent evaluation of the breach. All right, so now 3 days have gone by, and guys, I apologize if I'm going really fast. With only 45 minutes, I had a lot to cover, but 3 days have now gone by. We're in the first month. Now we start to think a little bit about communications, and let's talk about internal communications first. Immediately before initial external communications, we want to notify the people in-house. We want our associates, our managers, we want people to know about what's happened and what we're going to do and what we're going to communicate, because they're going to get questions. They're going to have questions. So we want to start to think about having information cascaded to our internal employees. You may want to establish an internal employee hotline or helpline, so if they have questions, they have someone to call. And then again, it can be escalated if necessary. If you are a public company, there may be certain stakeholders, large shareholders, that you feel it is important that you communicate before this goes public. You should do that prior to any outside communication. And you're going to want to start thinking about the things that you'll want to do to communicate outside of the organization. You want to start putting together your scripts for your call centers. You're going to want to start having the helpline scripted. And then it's time to send out the notices to the world, right? 47 states now require that if you have a data breach involving certain kinds of information, you have to give notice to the people who were affected. And if you have the list of people by address or email, you have to give it directly to them. If you do not maintain that information, such as an address or an email, you can do it by publishing it. So in 47 different states, if you're a nationwide organization, you have to give notice by sending out a publication of some sort. As you probably have noticed, you almost always see a press release associated with that, because the PR folks have a way of saying things that can hopefully help, diminish sort of the fallout of this. So you're going to want to have your press releases prepared within that first week or so. We always do frequently asked questions, and we post them on our website. For example, if I'm a Visa card holder that made a purchase at Target during this relevant time period, I can go to the Target website and I can get some of my questions answered. That not only helps share the information, but it also hopefully minimizes some of that call to the hotline, those kinds of things. You're going to want to be in touch with your insurer. You may or may not have coverage. And as you know, if you do have insurance, you have to give certain types of notice, and you have to give certain types of notice for the insurance company. So you're going to want to start to communicate with your insurance company. And then, while all this is going on, and I'm actually dealing with this right now for a client involved in a very large database, you are having daily communication with the payment card company. You are telling them on a daily basis the status of your investigation and what you're doing to remediate the damage and to keep them up to date on what's going on. So this is an ongoing thing, and it's happening, again, on a daily basis. Sure. It is not legally required in the sense that there isn't a payment card industry standard or a statute or something that requires it. It could sometimes be a part of a lawsuit resolution, but it is always done now. It's done as a matter of course now, more of as a goodwill measure. I think you hit the nail on the head. It is being done to help protect the customers. It's a relatively low cost for the retailer, by the way, as a side note. I shouldn't say that. I mean, there's cost associated with it, but it is not necessarily as extreme as you might think it is. But it has become sort of the operating procedure to offer that as a bit of security, as a bit of goodwill, peace of mind.
Would that be something you would have in your plan? Like, hey, we already contracted XYZ data monitoring company, or is that something you just kind of call them up and be like, hey, we do something for you?
Absolutely. One of the things I'm going to recommend as we get into our recommendations is that you have your vendors lined up, and that is one of the vendors you would have lined up. You would have a contract with them. You might not necessarily have any. You might not necessarily have to incur any cost just yet, but they would be in line and ready to go as soon as something were to happen. It's a great question. Any other questions, by the way? Customer communication. I covered this already, but I want to emphasize this. Again, particularly if you're in the retail world, as I work, or if you're in, if you're dealing with customers in any way, shape, or form, the hotel business, we've seen some hotel data breaches, etc. Protecting the customer and making them whole is the lifeline of your business. And we've seen so many instances now where the retailer has tried to sort of downplay, just by way of example. You suffered a data breach, and you issue a press release that says, we were the victim of an unlawful intrusion. Okay? Customers are not going to react positively to that, because you, the retailer, were not. Okay? In their minds, they're the victim. it's their customer, it's their credit card information, it's their customer information. Okay? So they're the victim. And I can't emphasize enough that whatever you do, whatever your plan looks like, you're going to really want to think about how you communicate to the outside world, which is particularly secure. Some organizations take the strategy that we're not going to share information. Okay? If we don't legally have to give notice, if one of those 47 states statutes is not implicated and I don't have to give notice, I'm not going to say anything about it. Okay? It's a plausible strategy. But I will tell you that in today's world of again, social media and blogging, and someone's going to find out that you had a data breach. And as soon as someone finds out that you had a data breach and you didn't tell anybody about it, you're the bad guy. Okay? So my suggestion is you think about your communication strategy, your communications to the outside world. You think about how you lay it out and what you want to say, and particularly how you protect the goodwill that you've built up with your customers over the years. So to do that, I would suggest a couple things. Number one, you got to be absolutely accurate. It goes back to the first question we have. That's that fine line we're walking. We want to share information, but it depends on how much we know. And we don't want to share information if it turns out not to be accurate. So we have to be very, very careful to share only accurate information. It should be as timely as possible, and it really should focus on protecting the customer. Here's the reference that I mentioned earlier about Target. I mean, again, they were trying to do the right thing. Originally, they thought it was 40 million. But then they had to correct themselves, and they said it was 70 million. Well, you all lied again with 70 million. Wow. It was an innocent mistake, I can tell you that, but it was still nonetheless a mistake. In that first month, as I mentioned, you're going to be dealing with not only the lawsuits, but investigations possibly by the Federal Trade Commission, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, other governmental agencies. I'm not saying it will happen. I'm saying it could happen, and you'll want to be prepared for it. Those types of organizations are going to ask questions like, were your security measures reasonable? So again, going back to the technical side, you're going to want to work with your IT, your CIO, to make sure that you have reasonable security measures in place. I would strongly encourage you to get some outside consultation on that, because there are people who can tell you what, for example, the FTC has decided not to be reasonable. Lawyers, for example, are able to help you with sort of precedent that's been addressed by the FTC, but there are other consultants that can help with that as well. So you're going to have to deal with that. If it's HIPAA, high-tech information, you may have to deal with the Office of Civil Rights. Again, if you're a public company, do you have to make disclosures in your 10Q or 10K? I mean, is there something that rises to the level of materiality that you have to disclose? So you have to be thinking about that. There very well could be attorneys general who are investigating you. I can tell you that in these large breaches that were alluded to earlier, the Cant and the Target and Home Depot, there are several AG investigations that were born out of those. So you're going to need to be prepared to deal with those. And then, of course, we've already talked about remediation. You're already in the process of trying to stem the results of this data intrusion. The first year and beyond, more to come. Review and finalize your forensic report to the payment card associations. I can't emphasize this enough. Literally, we're having daily calls with the payment cards in the current case I'm working on, and it's been 3 months, and we're working with the PFI. We're trying to build a relationship with the PFI, who again is preparing the report really for the payment card industry, so that we can, minimize our clients' risk. You may have, as I mentioned, your own independent forensic investigator. You're going to be working with that investigator for at least some period of time, and your remediation plan is probably ongoing. So these things continue on for a long, long time. Ongoing negotiations of assessments, as I mentioned, with the payment card industry, responding to document demand inquiry with respect to the litigation or investigation, and as I mentioned, class action lawsuits are a constant threat. So what are our immediate recommendations? Let's see how we're doing on time. We're about done here. Select and train your team now. Refine your workflow process. That should all be part of your data breach response plan. Evaluate imperatives of external communications. That's what I mentioned a minute ago when I said, really identify what is your strategy for communicating to the outside world. What is your philosophy? Maybe that's a better way of saying it. Do you want to be upfront and forthright, or would you rather not say anything if you didn't have to? That's a decision that should be made at the very highest level of the organization. Did I have a question here, someone? You should negotiate a contract with your outside forensic investigator now. Have them lined up. I mean, you may not ever need them. Hopefully, keep your fingers crossed. But having them in line is probably a good thing to do. Prepare your customer communications now. You can draft all of your communications now, even though you haven't had a data breach yet, right? You can draft your press releases. You can draft your frequently asked questions. You can draft your notices to the 47 states that I mentioned earlier. You can have all that in the can with some blanks in them, ready to go, so that in that first 24 hours, first 36 hours, first 72 hours, when you're in the heat of the battle, it'll all be right in front of you. I would strongly suggest that. Prepare management for your interviews. You know, again, talk to your upper level management about what is our philosophy? How are we going to handle media inquiries? Who's going to be the face of the company? A very, very important topic. Who is going to be the person that you put out there to represent the company? Someone who has goodwill with the customers, hopefully. Going back to the question we had earlier, I would have my contracts with the call centers in place now. Again, you don't have to start paying them yet, but have them lined up. We talked about reasonable security measures already. Evaluate and test your own systems. Again, you guys are the IT experts, but it should be an ongoing thing. I would suggest to you, by the way, that you should really look at your contracts with your various vendors. You may know that the intrusion at Target came through a refrigeration vendor. So the third-party contractor that Target used to keep their coolers working and operational in their stores where they keep their frozen food, they were using an online payment service, and that's where the intruders came through. So you should review the contracts that you have with all your outside vendors in terms of what their obligations are for data security. And that's all I have. I know we're out of time. I saw someone standing up in the back. Any questions real quick? Yes, ma'am.
Just out of curiosity, what are the 3 states that don't have the...
You know, I'll be honest with you, I don't remember off the top of my head. What we've done is we've created a singular form that we use in all states. Because we wanted to use the least common denominator. Sure. So we just did one form and we used it in all states. I can tell you that Massachusetts is the most difficult to deal with. I know that for sure. Anybody else? Well, thank you all for your time.